Welcome to another edition of Dan Factoids, where we address hard-hitting questions that divers have about diving, diving safety, diving accidents, fitness to dive, etc. And in this case, we have a question about a tech diver who went to 90 feet, or 30 meters if you will, close enough, and after a week, for the first time, developed an impairment of function in the so-called L4 or L5 distribution. And for those of you that don't necessarily remember the dermatomes, the way we remember it from medical school is 3 to the knee, 4 to the floor. In other words, L3 innervates the muscles down to the knee, and 4 innervates the muscles and the skin down to the foot and basically down to the floor. And then the sacral nerves basically come up the backside until, the anus. Right. So the question here was that the individual, 1, developed these symptoms a week after diving to a relatively shallow depth, then became constipated, and in spite of having CAT scans and having a colonoscopy, all that was found was so-called diverticulosis, which essentially means there's chronic constipation, which eventually leads to the point that the mucosa starts bulging out in the areas where the blood vessels go through the lining of the intestinal wall into the mucosa. So what I'm hearing here is that there is already a tendency to constipation. And so the answer that I would want to give here is that if the very first symptoms related to the dive occurred a week after the dive, there is no scientific way in which we would explain decompression illness or decompression sickness as being the cause. It just doesn't happen that way. Bubbles don't stay around that long, and you don't develop decompression illness that long after a dive. Secondly, we have evidence that there is malfunction of the large intestine because they found diverticulosis. So in this case, I would really far more focus on some structural abnormality in the spinal cord and or some malfunction or possibly a functional disturbance like irritable bowel syndrome that has to do with the function of the movement of food and eventually stool and the ability to evacuate the intestine. So my answer to your question is no, it's not diving related, and yes, it should be seen to, but the focus is going to be on the intestine, and in the unlikely event there may be either a vascular reason, because that we do sometimes find, where you could just, as with a coronary artery, you can have a vascular occlusion of an area of the intestine that can influence its function, or there may be a functional issue, which means that the intestine doesn't necessarily just clear itself as it should. And there are treatments for that, and they are certainly far better than anything we would do if we were to treat it for decompression illness. So that's the way I would recommend that you consider it. Thank you for asking the question, and until next time, safe diving.